Our scripture this morning is printed in your bulletin. It's from Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 through 16, and Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. Ruth 2, 1 through 16. Now Naomi had a relative through her husband, a warrior-hearted man of worth, from the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose eyes I may find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go, my daughter." And she went and came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she happened upon the part of the field that belonged to Boaz, who was from Elimelech's family. Then suddenly Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "God be with you." They answered, "God bless you." Then Boaz said to his boy stationed over the reapers, "To whom does this girl belong?" The boy stationed over the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite, the one who returned with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has been standing from the morning until now, only resting in the shelter a little. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Have you not heard, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither leave this one. Thus you will cling to my girls. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow after the girls. Have I not commanded the boys not to touch you? When you thirst, go to the vessels and drink from what the boys have drawn." Then she fell on her face and bowed to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you would distinguish me, as I am a foreigner?" And Boaz answered and said to her, "It has been told to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband, that you have forsaken your mother and father and your native land, and came to a people that you did not know before yesterday. May the Holy One of old reward your works, and may you have a full recompense from the Holy One, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then Ruth said, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken to the heart of your slave woman, and I am not one of your slave women." Boaz said to her when it was time to eat, "Draw near and eat from the bread and dip your piece in the vinegar." And she sat beside the reapers, and he handed her some roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied, and she had some left over. When Ruth got up to glean, Boaz commanded his boys, saying, "She may even glean between the sheaves. Do not humiliate her. You must also pull out some for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." And from Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my sibling to divide the inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Friend, who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?" Then Jesus said to the crowd, "Beware, be on guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life is not one's abundance of possessions." Then Jesus related a parable to them, saying, "A certain rich person produced land crops abundantly. And the person pondered internally, 'What should I do, for I have no place to store my crops?' Then that person said, 'This will I do. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and I will store there all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to the rich person, 'Fool, this very night your soul will be demanded back from you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." Please pray with me. God, Holy One, faithful and worthy One, open our eyes to the ways in which your will is done through the generosity of people who care for those who are in need. We are grateful for how it is that we have received your blessing and how good is multiplied in this world. Thank you for the ways that your love is spread through our relationships with one another. Even though we don't always see it, When we do good, goodness is multiplied. Thank you for your Spirit moving that goodness throughout your world. When we feel greedy, open our hearts to your love and compassion. Help us to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with you. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Carl and I have been watching the series Poldark on PBS. The books have been made into movies or series several times over the years, and this is the most recent one. The simplified version of the plot is that Ross Poldark, whose family lived on the Cornwall coast in England, had land where they mined several different ores there and supported the local folks as they worked. Ross had gone to fight against the colonists in the American Revolution, and he had been gone a long time and had been presumed dead. So when he returned, his fiancée was to marry his cousin, and his father's inheritance had mostly gone to his uncle and that cousin, although Ross owned some land and at least one mine, maybe two. But the core of the story is when he gets there, he has a desire to find ways that the residents of the area can feed, clothe, and shelter themselves and their families. Because these folks depend on those who own the land, because that's how it works, he and his cousin and others, for all they have. The landowners rent them homes and land, and the mine owners provide jobs so that they can buy what they need. Historically, it's the last years of the feudal system when mostly aristocracy holds all the land in England and the commoners are tenants. They're farmers, they're miners, they're other kinds of workers, but they don't own their own places. They have to rent or be allowed to live there, depending on who is your landlord. The story also turns on the rise of banking and greedy kinds of capitalism when the means of production are owned solely for the benefit of the stockholders. Ross sees his duty instead to those who live in and around the country in Cornwall, and others see only their duty to gain wealth for themselves. So that's where the conflict in this story comes. What Ross does not see is that the system itself is kind of the problem, because the commoners have little hope of doing anything other than backbreaking work, and they have very little hope for living better lives while they are there. So as I was reading this passage about Boaz and his position in the culture, it reminded me of this fictional Poldark story, because they are both told about places and times when wealth was often limited to those who inherited it. And that was generally limited to men who inherited it. And so we have Boaz, who has this authority over this land and his fields and the people in his fields and his home. The authority that he has is emphasized in the way that Dr. Gaffney translates the nouns in the text. She writes, there's a lot going on in Boaz's field in terms of gender, class, and identity. It's being worked by women and men who, due to their social status relative to Boaz, he calls girls and boys, even though they are grown people. Very much in the way that some used to refer to grown men as houseboys, also evoking the racist practice of black women and men being called gal and boy in and not just in the South. So there's kind of this noun thing that's happening as she translates it because of the words that are actually used in the text that isn't always translated that way. According to the language of the narrator and the words spoken by Boaz, though, the workers on his land and in his own aren't considered slaves. They weren't owned, they were employed. They were just of a lower social status. Yet Ruth doesn't understand and does call herself and other women slave women. And she may be reflecting what she would see in her own culture back in Moab. I don't know that for sure. She may just be being subservient and gracious to him to show that she believes herself lower than him. Hard to tell. She may just assume that because he owns the land, she and the others working are his subjects or slaves. Understanding the inequities and the injustices that are integral to that place and time helps us see the story, though, as something other than a romantic one. I've heard it told that way, that this is like a romance story between Ruth and Boaz, who fall in love and live happily ever after, like we might imagine in a fairy tale or a romance, although those are just about as complicated. The story of Ruth instead reveals things about the social structure of the day. It shows the vulnerability of women, perhaps especially foreign women, since Boaz warns the so-called boys he employed not to touch Ruth, and he warns them twice, at the beginning and at the end of the story that we read today. He doesn't necessarily warn them against touching other women. Maybe it's because she's particularly vulnerable as a foreign woman, as a Moabite. She's presumed to be less than virtuous, just simply because she's not known to them. His warning may have been stronger for her because she was more vulnerable and likely to be harassed as a stranger, not seen as somebody who was under anybody's protection. And the characters of Boaz and Ruth are revealed in this passage. What are they like? Boaz, as Dr. Gaffney translated, is a warrior-hearted man of worth. He's both wealthy and brave. He recognized Ruth as a good woman who has taken care of her mother-in-law after the death of Ruth's husband. And he recognizes that she's been so faithful that she left her own homeland behind to come to a place where she didn't know anyone. Boaz's generosity, virtue, and worthiness are revealed as he asks after her, seeing her in the field, and recognized that she might be unsafe, at risk of assault, without some kind of protection. So he offers his. He warned the men, who he calls boys, working for him. He told her to stay and work on his land so that he could protect her. And he invited her to drink of the water that his employees provided, like the women who worked for him. And finally, he asked her to eat with his workers and gave her food himself from his plate, which probably also communicated a protection as people witnessed that. And then he told his men to allow her to glean beyond the edges of the land that was required by law, and to also pull out grain so that she could have more. He's definitely a man of his time and his age and his society. Yet he works within that time and place and within the law that is given and within the understanding of the traditions that there are there to create a place of safety for Ruth and thus for Naomi, who relies upon Ruth for what she has to eat as the time goes on. Now, the main purpose of telling this whole story of Ruth and Naomi is the establishment of David's lineage, as we get to at the end. We also get to be in on the righteousness and goodness of his ancestry. And through the stories that continue to be told through the New Testament, we get to realize that Jesus' lineage was also established through Ruth, the Moabite woman, and through the women earlier in his heritage. These included Tamar, who had to fight for her right to bear a son with Judah, and Rahab, whose home was Jericho. As his story is told, and David's story is told, both are the product of unions that might not have been considered acceptable by some because of faith or race or social class. So the story of Ruth and Boaz is one where a wealthy man shows his generosity toward those in need as he follows not only the letter of the law, but its compassionate heart. He reaches out beyond what was required and offered what was necessary and what could give both Ruth and Naomi hope for the future, not just a matter of survival, but hope. Now, the parable that Jesus told his disciples is about a wealthy man too. He told it in response to someone who wanted Jesus to be an advocate in the case of an inheritance. Now, I don't know if Jesus knew the circumstances of the person who asked, but he does use that question, that hope of protection as an opportunity to warn against greed and amassing great wealth. I don't know if he's warning the person who asked the question or if he's warning the relative that won't share, but he uses it as an example. Now, wealth was often seen as a blessing to those who were righteous and behaved well toward those around them, particularly in the Psalms and in the book of Proverbs. Though there are stories of the unrighteous becoming wealthy through their injustices and warnings from the prophets about those who gained their riches by cheating the poor. In Jesus' parable, he doesn't say that the rich person was a really bad man, that he did awful things, but just said that instead of recognizing when he had enough, he built bigger barns so that he could keep everything. In this case, Jesus reminded those around him also that wealth didn't save anybody from dying eventually, and reminding them that you can't take it with you. Both Boaz and the fictional Ross Poldark were pursuing righteousness for those around them. Yet we can also see that each one didn't see how even in their relative generosity and their desire to help, the problem was the way in which different kinds of people were treated unequally for no good reason, and how different kinds of people were not given compassion. Greed and injustice lay under the need that they were attempting to address. We can applaud their generosity and their acts of compassion. We can also see that in their world and in our own, we need to address inequities, inequality, and injustice beyond our own individual generosity or that of the wealthiest among us. Boaz didn't necessarily see all women's vulnerability to assault, poverty, and need was the problem, but just that he could offer his protection to his kinswoman Naomi and her daughter-in-law. The rich man of Jesus' parable saw nothing beyond his own acquisition of material goods. That's how a parable works, because it's just a little short story. But Jesus was teaching that life was about more than acquisition, more than getting all that you can. When taken as one of the teachings among the others that Jesus taught, we can see that he was pointing out that wealth was only a blessing when it did good for people, not when it sat in a barn. One of my favorite lines from a movie is spoken by Dolly Levi in Hello, Dolly. She said, "Money, pardon the expression, is like manure. It's not worth a thing unless it's spread around, encouraging young things to grow, or all things to grow." Wealth is only salvation when it's used to provide what's necessary for life, not when it's filling a barn or packed away, but when it's flowing freely and available for everyone, regardless of situation of birth or class or gender. We do live in a more egalitarian society than many in history, and yet we are at risk of losing the progress that we have achieved at this point. There is enough food produced in this world to feed everyone who lives in it, and yet there are still people who don't have adequate food. There are people everywhere who don't have adequate housing, sometimes housing at all. May we open our eyes to the problems and inequities of the world and find ways to work together to address those with hope, with flexibility, and with the mercy and compassion that we have received from God. To the glory of our loving God, our Creator, our Redeemer, and everlasting Spirit. Amen.